Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Left Book Club event. Tonight, we'll be discussing our book of the month that was for October, Abolishing the Police, with some really inspiring guests, all under one, virtual roof. Um, and the Left Book Club is a subscription book club and not-for-profit initiative. We publish collectible editions of radical and progressive books, which are uniquely available to our members. We seek to foster a spirit of collective learning and political education, aiming to create spaces and avenues where people can learn from each other and discuss radical ideas that inform actions and practical steps, with the goal of supporting the struggles fighting for us all. Tonight, don't forget to ask your questions on the YouTube live stream chat where you're watching us tonight. And if you would like to become a member of the Left Book Club, please visit leftbookclub.com. Don't forget to follow the Left Book Club on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook to keep up to date with our events like these and some promotions and giveaways, especially that Christmas is around the corner. Subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're watching us tonight. And just a quick reminder, this has never happened in any of our events, but if the stream does go choppy, please stay with us and we'll make sure that we continue to running as soon as possible. So a little bit about this event. I know lots of people have been very excited about it. Today we are joined by the editor of Abolishing the Police, Koshka Duff, and guests Becka Hudson, Arianne, Shahvisi, and Tanzil Chowdhury to discuss the tensions between policing on the one hand and values like freedom, equality, and democracy on the other. I'll introduce all our guests tonight and then hand over to Koshka, who will chair the rest of the discussion. Koshka Duff is a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Nottingham with interests including social and political philosophy, German philosophy, and philosophy of music. She participates in strikes, protests, and other forms of struggle around education, housing, sexual and reproductive justice, and policing, and was a co-organizer of Cops Off Campus. She is also a pianist and translator of poetry. Becka Hudson is a researcher and campaigner in criminal justice issues. Her research is focused on the relationship of psychiatric diagnoses to prison building projects, both in Britain and its empires, past and in British prisons today. She has been involved in a number of campaigns around criminalization and policing. Arianne Shahvisi is senior lecturer in ethics at the Brighton and Sussex Medical School. She has broad academic interests, including feminist philosophy, bioethics, and philosophy of science, and has published articles and book chapters across these areas. Arianne writes regularly for the London Review of Books and has also been published in The Guardian, The Independent, and The Economist. She is writing a book on the philosophy of social justice, which will be published by Penguin in 2022, so next year. Tanzil Chowdhury is a lecturer in public law at Queen Mary University of London and the co-director for the Centre for Law and Society in a Global Context. As well as being a contributor to the book Abolishing the Police, he has also authored the monograph Time, Temporality, and Legal Judgment. He was one of the founders of the Northern Police Monitoring Project and has also helped set up the Greater Manchester Law Centre. So without further ado, over to you, Koshka.
Thank you so much, Ella, for that lovely introduction, and to Left Book Club for hosting us this event, and for selecting this book to be part of your series. I'm extremely excited about the book, not least because of the wonderful contributors who will be having a conversation with here tonight. I am really just here to kick off the event and then to chair a conversation with your questions to you, the audience, and a few questions of my own that I'm going to put to the panelists. So to introduce the conversation about abolishing the police, I thought I would just say a little bit about what we meant by those words. So what we meant by policing, first of all. And this is an area, how we understand what we're talking about is often a very kind of a key matter. The thing I think is a really exciting contribution of this collection is the broad, expansive and detailed understanding of what policing involves that it develops. So policing is not only the police, that one institution so-called, but rather, and here I'm going to quote a little bit from the collection, policing includes the whole criminal punishment system of courts, prisons, juvenile detention facilities, electronic tagging. It includes the mechanisms of border enforcement, such as detention centres, walls and barbed wire fences, chartered deportation flights. It spreads into the most intimate aspects of life in the form of mass and targeted surveillance. And it spreads beyond state boundaries in the form of colonial and neo-colonial counterinsurgency operations, the pacification of unruly populations, and the extraordinary rendition of terror suspects. So when we're talking about policing, we're talking about all of that. I also wanted to say a little about what we mean by abolition. And here I want to quote from the fantastic chapter in this book by Sarah Lambo. The chapter is called Practicing Everyday Abolition. This is what Lambo says. As leading abolitionist thinker and organizer Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, abolition is not simply about getting rid of the prisons, police, or systems of surveillance and punishment. It is about what we put in their place. And this is a quote from Wilson Gilmore. Abolition is about abolishing the conditions under which prison became the solution to problems, rather than abolishing the buildings we call prisons. And Lambo continues, likewise, we cannot simply do away with the police. We need to address the conditions in which people feel that police are the only or best option for responding to harm in their lives. We must build other means for preventing and addressing harm that will actually keep us safe. Part of that task means not treating abolition as a singular or revolutionary event, but as an ongoing process and practice. Abolition is a way of life and a collective approach to social change. It requires us to engage in strategies that dismantle the structures, institutions, and systems that underpin and sustain prisons and police, while at the same time building up systems of care, well-being, and support that fulfill human needs and enable communities to flourish. Abolition requires the double work of engaging in what abolitionists call non-reformist reforms. These are strategies that reduce the power and scope of the criminal justice system and reduce our reliance on it, while simultaneously building up our skills, capacity, and resources for alternative systems of preventing, addressing, and responding to harm. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about abolishing the police and the abolition of policing. Finally, I just wanted to say something about how we have approached putting this book together and emphasize something that I think is really important about it, which is its accessibility to broad and varied audiences. While at the same time being a rigorous and making a distinctive theoretical contribution to our understanding of policing and resistance to it. So I'm just going to read a little from my introduction now to explain how we've approached this. This collection is written by people who have experienced and borne witness to state violence, have been part of struggles against it, and write out of commitment to those struggles. This commitment brings with it a political responsibility to write in a way that is not academic in an exclusionary sense. Many people with crucial insights into the realities of the current system and how to resist it gain sharp edge of policing, of academic training. An analysis of the injustices of policing that was inaccessible to them would be self-defeating. On the other hand, denying ourselves the use of any vocabulary that might be unfamiliar to readers would mean discarding many powerful tools for understanding and fighting oppression. Concepts like ideology, which I spent some time explaining earlier in the introduction, like racial capitalism, disciplinary power, and intersectionality. These are weapons honed over decades and even centuries of rebellious theory making, devised and tested and contested in the context of real political struggles. To throw them away limits the thoughts we can express. It limits our ability to say true things about the police and what is wrong with them and what we can and should do about it. It is also patronizing as well as simply inaccurate to assume an inability or an unwillingness to engage in complex thinking on the part of those outside of academic institutions. Science, patience, torture, the vows of the sun and the sea. We have wanted to make this book an introduction in the literal sense of leading in. The word comes from Latin introducere, where intro means to the inside, and ducere, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Romans tell me off, means to lead. We have therefore used theoretical terms where they are necessary to express ideas that we think are important, while making sure that potentially unfamiliar words are clearly explained. Explanations are included in a text where possible, and also in the online glossary that accompanies the book. And I want to draw a lot of attention to the online glossary. It's a resource that I'm really, really excited that we've been able to make together. Terms in the glossary appear in bold when the first time they occur in each piece. In these ways, and there are other resources surrounding the book as well, including audio versions of some of the pieces, hopefully all of the pieces before too long, and a study guide of questions that you can use yourself to kind of discuss and explore the pieces in more depth. And I'm going to be drawing on some of that study guide in the questions that I put to our panelists today. In these ways, we invite readers to learn to speak new critical languages. Insofar as these are still languages of the powerful, used to exclude and marginalize, we want to subvert them to speak and enable others to speak to the relatively privileged in ways they cannot so easily dismiss. We believe this is one way to bridge the epistemic gulf mentioned earlier, epistemic gulf being, as I explained before, earlier in the introduction, a gap in knowledge and understanding between the people who experience policing themselves and those who don't. Epistemic gulf between the protected and the policed. A strategy not superior to, but in solidarity with, other ways of bridging this gulf, also mentioned earlier in the introduction, such as setting fire to police stations. So thus ends my intro, and I'd like to hand over now to each of the wonderful contributors in turn, and I will start off in the order that their pieces appear in the collection, and so I'll invite them to just say what their piece is about, what it contributes to the collection. So Arianne, first of all, thank you very much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to the Left Book Club for hosting us tonight. And thank you so much, Koshka, for editing this book and for inviting me to contribute. I remember that email coming in and the subject line was invitation to contribute to abolishing the police, which just sounded like such an amazing opportunity right from the outset. So my chapter within the book was entitled "We Are All Police Now, Resisting Everyday Bordering in the Hostile Environment." And so I'll say a little bit about the chapter, and then I've just kind of written a little bit something that kind of summarizes some bits of it. And so I'll read that out for the benefit of those who haven't read the chapter. So My chapter talks about something called everyday bordering. It also talks about the hostile environment. And I wrote this chapter to attend to some gaps as I saw them in the abolition discourse in the UK. And around the time that I was writing the chapter, the Black Lives Matter movement was gaining greater attention as a movement against anti-Black racism. But I was noticing that many of those conversations were ignoring or not attending to the fact that around 40% of those who seek asylum in the UK are Black. Also, discussions about police violence and abolition in some cases ignore border policing and the very powerful ways in which notions of criminality are deployed to exclude particular migrants from our moral community. And so the chapter really is about kind of addressing those two things. And so over the last 50 years, borders have started to kind of move into the interior of the state in ever more obvious ways. So from the 1970s onwards, new legislation has been introduced in successive government acts, which has brought a wider range of kind of everyday services, institutions and workers into the job of border policing. And so workplaces, marriages, housing, hospitals, vehicles, banks, schools and universities are now sites of bordering. And this is what I mean by everyday bordering. And the idea really, the idea of doing this has been to kind of corner irregular migrants and to ensure that their interactions with services that are absolutely essential become increasingly difficult and hostile. And also to produce additional opportunities for surveillance, detection, and arrest. And so the place we're at the moment is that irregular migrants are now forbidden from working, driving, renting, and required to pay prohibitive fees for hospital care. So the reason for this is that devolving border policing in this way, so moving it out to lots of different agents, saves the government money, but it also allows a greater part of our social world to be kind of dragged into this now ordinary activity of bordering. And so employers and bank workers and landlords and healthcare workers and educational professionals have to check the immigration status of those they encounter. This is like a kind of regular part of their work now, which makes them complicit with the border regime. And this, of course, produces new opportunities for racism to occur. So it means that racial profiling, for example, is much more readily excused, and racialized people as a whole face additional barriers to just accessing any of these basic services because of the sorts of questions that are going to be asked and that the hostility that they will likely face. And I think one of the functions of this, and I argue in the chapter that one of the functions of this everyday bordering is to contribute to a sense of identity and security for those who are white and British, to sort of serve as a kind of visible reassurance that certain resources are being reserved for British citizens, which tends to kind of secure the political support of particular people. And I call this, in the chapter, I call this conspicuous marginalization. So certain groups are being marginalized, and that marginalization is being very much announced. So I talk about the kind of go home vans that were driven around certain London boroughs. And the idea here is to win the favor of a very particular audience. What this also does is this conspicuous marginalization also protects the government against criticism for its austerity regime, so that perceptions of scarcity are instead blamed on migrants. And then that additionally provides this perpetual mandate for further anti-immigration measures. So they kind of win on every front. And for people of colour and migrants, everyday bordering makes racism a much more regular and entrenched feature of every interaction they have with the state. And while this legislation is officially, so when you hear government officials talk about it, it's officially supposed to target irregular migrants very specifically, of course, racism never has that kind of specificity in practice, not that that would be okay anyway. So the hostile environment kind of spills over and ends up marginalizing migrants and people of color more generally. And that's a really important part of conspicuous marginalization, because the objective here is to target anyone who's, or from a race perspective, certainly anyone whose claim upon resources is deemed to be questionable in some way. So at the heart of this idea of everyday bordering, there's this kind of largely unquestioned discourse around irregular migrants being criminals. And on a trivial reading, irregular migrants are criminals, in fact, because they have entered or remained in the UK in contravention of law. And to clarify on this point, because there's often discussion around this, many asylum seekers do enter the UK illegally, but the Refugee Convention dictates that they can't be penalised for doing so if they seek asylum without delay and have good reason to have entered, if that makes sense. So you often hear this thing of, is it really illegal, or is it, but it's unauthorised entry, which is in fact permissible in accordance with the Refugee Convention. And in any case, this is, essentially completely unavoidable, because legal entry is all but impossible, and most asylum applications end up being rejected. So public discourse around immigration portrays irregular migrants as kind of automatically villainous, mostly because they intend to or hope to access the benefits of living in the UK, of UK society. And this is the way the sort of criminality strand is often presented, that these people are here to steal something, to take something that isn't theirs from people who have more of a right to it. And this is despite the fact that, of course, irregular migrants actually can't claim welfare payments, massively underuse even the public services to which they're entitled for free, and are very often exploited for, do work, but are exploited for less than minimum wage. And so I just want to say something quickly about this criminality discourse in relation to migrants, because it's complex and it really needs careful analysis. So on the one hand, we have the government and the media insisting upon the criminality of irregular migrants and criticising migrants more generally as well, and often criticised for working, i.e. stealing jobs, not working, scrounging, you kind of can't win in that regard, and for failing to adhere to British culture, right, whatever that might mean. And there's a sort of grudging acceptance that's sometimes extended to those migrants who are considered to be good migrants, right, who in many cases are those who, for example, work for the NHS. So you have that on the one side, and on the other side, you have those who sympathise with irregular migrants, and in doing so sometimes make another error and resort to defending the innocence of irregular migrants, insisting they're not criminals. And this too has problems, because first of all, it's false in the sense that many are criminals in the official sense of what it means to be a criminal, right? They are breaking the law by entering in an unauthorized way or remaining when they don't have authorization to do so. But resisting this label of criminality also tends to end up with people emphasizing the victimhood of irregular migrants, or trying to present migrants as being innocent, good, honest, or useful people. Which is not only just completely unrealistic, but it tends to reinforce this really troubling idea that only those migrants who are deemed to be good migrants should be permitted membership and access to essential resources. And obviously that's not a standard that is applied to non-migrants in the UK. It's an unacceptable standard. And then most importantly, maybe, the insistence that irregular migrants, or migrants more generally, should not be called criminals tends to end up kind of more firmly emphasizing the idea that other people are criminals and should be called criminals. And this sort of tends to legitimize the idea of criminality more generally. And when you call out the misuse of a term, that tends to have the effect of bolstering its, that term being reasonable in other contexts. And so I think when we do this, when we insist upon the lack of criminality, sometimes we end up missing the opportunity to actually see parallels between those who are criminalized by borders and those who are criminalized by inequality in other ways. And I think what we should instead be doing is seeing the criminality of irregular migrants as a special case of a questionable concept of criminality more generally. And in almost all cases, criminals are those people who are deprived not only of the sorts of basic goods that are necessary to their well-being and their dignity, but also of any socially or legally acceptable route to actually accessing those goods. And obviously what we're living in a society where the privatization of tremendous amounts of wealth means that the opportunities that people have to lead dignified lives become smaller and smaller and smaller, which tends to necessitate this criminality. And borders are, of course, as far as I can see, the ultimate mechanisms of inequality. They are designed to enclose and concentrate wealth in particular world regions, and then kind of criminalize anybody who makes any attempt to access that wealth. And what this criminality framing does when we talk about borders is that it tends to completely ignore the reasons why people attempt to migrate to the UK in the first place. And so it's presenting migrants as criminals rather than as the victims of prior moral crimes. And the UK has, of course, made so much of the world, so much of the global south, a place where people cannot meet their needs and live with dignity. And so I'll just finish by saying that, not only do many migrants have a very obvious, to me at least, moral claim upon the resources which they migrate in order to have access to, but their supposed crime, that of crossing borders, is necessary partly because British colonizers disregarded borders in order to amass the wealth that now makes the UK such an attractive place for migrants to travel to. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Arianne. Ending on thinking about the colonial history and construction of borders leads perfectly onto our next speaker, which is Tanzil Chowdhury, who's going to talk about his chapter in the book, From the Colony to the Metropole, Race Policing and the Colonial Boomerang. So over to you, Tanzil.
So thanks to the Left Book Club for hosting us, and to my fellow authors, and to Elif for putting this together, also to Koshka again for curating this collection, and Kat for her wonderful illustrations. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. I will summarise the key themes of the chapter, but I also want to say something a bit more generally about the kinds of arguments that are advanced in the book and why I think they're important. And then I'm going to end by saying a few short things about abolitionist cultures more generally. Now, myself and Koshka actually spoke together in Edinburgh on the book a few days ago, so I am going to act like everything that I'm saying is completely new. So Koshka, if you could refrain from being like, oh, why is he making it out like that's a natural joke or whatever, just pretend like I'm just making this all up now. So in terms of the kind of claims of the chapter, it begins by looking at some of the critical histories of policing, and often those critical histories are wrought with a kind of methodological nationalism. What they get right is by locating the origins of the policing with the rise of industrial capitalism and the beginnings of a slowly emerging organising labour force. But what they often elide is the imperial state. Britain's, Britain is the foremost imperial power. And once we take these two things together, we can then think about how the imperial project and imperialism as a project of capitalist reproduction, how that shapes the technologies of the British state and British state violence today. And part of the chapter uses this notion of the colonial boomerang, which is popularised by the likes of George Padmore, Aimé Césaire, Hannah Arendt, Foucault. And the idea is that the colonies are effectively laboratories in which new technologies and forms of violence can be enacted and tried out, and then sent back over to the metropole, often in the kind of policing of racialised and working class communities. And the example that I focus on in the chapter is on the UK's oldest settler colony, that of the north of the Republic of Ireland, or Northern Ireland, as the British state calls it, which provided an important space for the logistical and strategic experimentation of racialisation and policing of dissent and anti-colonial resistance. So those are the kind of claims of that chapter. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of arguments that were advanced in the entirety of the collection. So I think the kinds of arguments that are made, or one of the kind of veins that runs throughout the book is one of a historical argument. And by that, what I mean is that the book seeks to locate the police within a particular historical and therefore socio-economic and thus political context. In other words, it tries to upset this idea that the police are this trans-historical force that has existed in some shape or form in all societies throughout history. It tries to counter the idea that societies need the police or policing. It denaturalizes them. It identifies them, to use the term from Susan Marks, as a false necessity. So we see the police force, certainly in the UK milieu, emerging in the context of increasing labour organisation and unrest in the 1800s, and of course the imperial strategy to counter the tide of anti-colonial resistance. So far from being a tool of crime prevention, and that's the term I use loosely, it really begins as an institution that enacts social control on behalf of capital and empire. Now, I don't mean to suggest that once we recognise the contingency of something, that it's easier to get rid of, right? You know, we all understand that race is a social relation, or that, you know, the nation is an imagined community, but they still have real effects. But what I think the book does is to upset this kind of absolute reification that I think the police embody, that all societies need police or policing. Now, another element of the arguments that I think are prevalent throughout the book is, and Koshka referred to it at the beginning, is identifying the kind of continuities as well as the ruptures in policing as it was maybe in earlier modern history or in imperial antiquity, and policing today. And I mean, I'm you know, looking at it in the context of the relationship between the colonies and the metropole, I'm very much a student of this stuff. I would encourage people to refer to Adam Elliott Cooper's book on Black resistance to British policing for a much more forensic and expertly analysis on this relationship. But one of the important things I think the book does is to look at how policing, rather than the noun of the police, is enacted today. So looking at things like the counter-terrorism strategy and the subcontracting of policing to public sector workers in the counter-terrorism strategy, which is now a kind of statutory duty since the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act. The last point I want to make is about abolitionist political cultures, or cultures of abolitionist politics. Now, abolitionist politics have existed since time immemorial. We could say that Spartacus, a gladiator that led a slave uprising against the Roman Republic, was an abolitionist, though there is some dispute over whether or not the Third Servile War was to abolish slavery. But perhaps the reference we're more familiar with is the Haitian slave uprising and the establishment of the first Black Republic. In the contemporary moment, the canonical works of Angela Davis and Ruthie Gilmore's critical resistance, really pushed prison and abolition politics. And there's been various, obviously, contemporary articulations of this, such as divestiture or defunding the police. But what about the role of abolitionist politics in popular culture? How do we create a common sense, to use a Gramscian term, of police abolition? And by common sense, we can understand this as the accumulation of taken for granted knowledges that structure the basic landscapes within which individuals are socialized and chart their life courses. Now, I don't have a clear-cut answer to this, but a couple of weeks ago, I came across a very interesting review in the LA Review of Books by Arianne on the mayor of Easttown. Now, just to be clear, I haven't actually watched the mayor of Easttown. I have a bad habit of reading reviews of things that I will subsequently watch. And I'm by no means saying that the mayor of Easttown is some kind of militant abolitionist cultural artifact. But something that I found interesting that speaks to a arguably nascent abolitionist pop culture was this show. Because what it does is to unspectacularize abolitionist politics. This is a show with its lead as Kate Winslet. Now, the premise of the show is about a police detective, Mayor Sheehan, who investigates the murder of a teenage mother while trying to kind of keep it together in her own personal life. And I just want to read this quote from the LA Review of Books. Quote, "What we mostly see in the mayor of Easttown, where no one's problems have policing as their solution, and where no one seems to like our protagonist, the cop, the sister who won't press charges on her brother, because what would that accomplish, sets the tone in episode 1, and it goes on from there. As a cop, we see Mayor erase video evidence, tackle an old man with dementia, and plant drugs in Carrie's car. But the most socially beneficial cop intervention we see are specifically non-carceral, like calling the gas company to yell at them for turning off the heat, driving someone to the parish shelter, or just rounding up a bereaved father's family to comfort him when you bring the bad news. When Mayor is on full badge and gun mode, she mostly just brings violence to her own town, which is also her family who try to avoid her as much as possible." That's me done.
Thank you so much, Tanzil. That was brilliant. Even better the second time. Love it. If I could pass over now to Becka Hudson. Becca wrote a really fantastic chapter on statues and gangs, fascist panic and policing. And I will leave it to Becca to tell you more about that. Thank you.
Hi, hi, I'm Becca. Thank you to everybody who put this event together, and certainly to Kosh and everybody at Dog Section Press as well, who helped to get the book together. I'm going to be fairly brief, only because I'm like quite ill and my brain is very slow right now. But the chapter that I contributed to the book, I guess, was looking at the way in which what policing's relationship is to the far right and to right politics in general. And so the kind of starting off point for that, which I think, you know, a number of people have mentioned as being a transformative moment in the way that they thought about their chapter and their contribution, was the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, or its kind of resurgence in 2020. And, you know, like, shout out to insurgent street politics for doing that, because it's clearly shaped what everybody has done thereafter. And the particular moment that I start off with is in the middle of, so there was a few Black Lives Matter marches that were happening across the country in the UK, and these were some of the largest anti-racist demonstrations that have ever happened in this country's history. And then there was a counter demonstration that came from a quite large constellation of right and far right and some outright fascist groups. And nominally, the reason that they wanted to counter-protest Black Lives Matter was because there had been a desecration of important statues, one of which being the statue of Edward Colston, which was dumped into, as everybody will have seen, was dumped into the water. And the other was that somebody wrote racist on a statue of Winston Churchill, which is in Parliament Square. And so this was the kind of reason that these far-right protesters went out that day. And the particular moment that you can see on a video, I think was linked to on the online version of the article, of the chapter, sorry, is that some far-right member of a far-right protest is shouting at a police officer, they're Antifa, as in anti-fascist. Later on in the same demonstration, quite a large crowd of people who are part of this protest are yelling at the police, where were you last week? Where were you last week? I.e. saying that the police did not properly or adequately do their job, which was to aggressively repress the Black Lives Matter protesters. Now, of course, we know this to be entirely untrue. There was an incredibly aggressive police response to a number of Black Lives Matter demonstrations that happened, including horse charges, one horse which kind of, its rider was knocked off by a lamppost, but it narrowly missed a young woman who was protesting that day, and she was injured. There were kettling of young people, including children, until 2 or 3 in the morning, where people were not allowed out of the kettle until late at night. And there's a report that was done, I think, by the Network for Police Monitoring, which looks at the incredibly aggressive and indeed racist ways in which the Black Lives Matter protests were policed. So what does it mean, basically, is what I was interested in looking at. Why are far-right protesters accusing police of being anti-fascist? And why are they accusing them of not adequately policing Black Lives Matter protesters? And kind of, I develop a whole argument around this that looks at other kinds of examples, and the way in which what happened in that kind of process is that those far-right protesters were essentially lobbying the police, and it worked very well for them, to take on a more aggressive role, a further racist criminalization of the kind of groups that the far right wanted to target and to attack. So we see the igniting moment supposedly for their protest, the statues, has now, just over a year later, been solidified into legislation. We have, as part of the police crime courts and sentencing bill, a specific stipulation that if statues are, if criminal damage to statues takes place, it is a specific offence aside from a normal criminal damage offence that can get you up to 10 years in prison. So what those far-right protesters were demanding of government and accusing the police of that day has actually been very quickly solidified into legislation, and it is something that the police will now go on to police, as well as our court system and our prison system. We will see, or could see, people who have in some way attacked statues end up potentially spending a decade in prison as a result of that demand. And really the overall argument that I'm trying to make in the piece is that we, as a broad left, be we abolitionist or not, should take that strategy from the right very seriously. That actually a lot of kind of far-right tacticians and strategists understand the role of the police to be one that they can easily manipulate, that their demands are very easily greased through to state legislation, particularly under the kind of government that we have now, but not only. And this was absolutely a feature of New Labour, and I think we can safely say it's absolutely a feature of Starmer's Labour to play to these kind of politics. And so I think in some ways it's a kind of invitation to people who might not think of themselves yet as abolitionists to understand the way in which policing can only ever be pulled rightwards. It's not a lever on which the left can make any kind of progressive gain. And I think the example of the far right making this demand and very, very quickly having it met by government and then enforced by the very police who they were accusing of being anti-fascist, who they were accusing of not doing the level of racist violence that they would have liked them to do that day, is a kind of potent example of how that process works. And so I guess the invitation or the question is to us here and to the left in general and abolitionists is, if we know that the far right can use demands on policing to get, you know, their demands met very, very quickly by the state. What are our strategy? What are our tactics in that kind of political context with the resources and tools and power that we have at our disposal? And I think that, you know, my answer to that would be, you absolutely make no demands on policing at all, because it's not our organisation, it's not our institution, it's not our friend, and it's not to be used by anybody who considers themselves to be on the left. Yeah, I think that's me done. Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Becca. So what I would like to do now is actually to pick up on a few of the things that you said, to now direct some questions from the online resources from the study guide to our panelists. And I wanted to pick up on well, where you ended, Becca, in fact, on really this kind of question of well, what is what does this analysis of policing kind of mean for anyone who's involved in emancipatory struggle? What are the kind of lessons for how to engage in resistance and dissent from existing forms of oppression? Tanzil, you also were emphasizing this really key thought that resistance to policing is as old as policing itself. So not to get trapped within the kind of the doom machine of a view of domination as total and absolute. And there's it's a point that I kind of bring out in my introduction, because I think it's important that the idea that the police are all powerful, or that the resistance is futile, is actually a belief that kind of or that there is no resistance, that people accept this, and it's these are actually kind of ideological views that are very conducive to the police. Because of course, if you think that resistance is futile, you won't resist. So thank you for emphasizing that. And it points me towards one of the questions in the study guide for you, Arianne. So maybe I could start with you. I know that you do write about this a bit in your chapter, so it'd be really nice to hear. The question is, what do you think that we can do to resist everyday bordering?
Yeah, thanks, Koshka. Yeah, it's a really good question. In the chapter, I write quite a lot about the NHS, which is where a lot of my research has been focused on that particular context. So this idea that at the moment, though most people don't know this, for anything beyond kind of basic care, NHS care is actually chargeable for anyone who's not ordinarily resident within the UK, which means they lived in the UK for 5 years with documentation. So that's all irregular migrants who are expected to pay for NHS care. And there have been, clearly this is something that is extraordinarily distressing for health workers, right? So you're faced with somebody who is in desperate need of medical care, and you want to make a referral for them to access that care. So you're referring them from a GP service, which is free for everybody, to a hospital, for example, which is not free for everybody unless you're going into A&E. So maternity care, for example, would fall into this category, right? Somebody who needs maternity care has to pay for that care. And of course, as a doctor, you want to tell the patient that they are, this care will be chargeable. And that's an extraordinarily distressing position to be put in, because the patient can turn around and say, well, I can't pay for it, right? And the added complication there is that if a person holds a debt to the NHS of more than £500 after 2 months, that their details will be passed on to the Home Office from the NHS as well. So, doctors are then in this really difficult position where they're trying to care for patients as well as they can, but realizing that the system is not allowing them to do this and that people may well start rejecting the care that they need. Now, campaigns have been, doctors are clearly very unhappy about this, extraordinarily morally distressing to be put into this situation. There's been a campaign called Docs Not Cops, and there's this fantastic guide online which kind of explains various different ways in which health workers can kind of resist this. And I've spoken to teams of people, like whole teams who work together in a hospital, who have said, we're not doing it. We are not charging patients, right? And they're kind of relying in some ways upon a bit of confusion within the system because it's so complex to actually just utterly reject this and try to push back at every single point. And so there's lots of activism within healthcare, so that although officially people are supposed to be doing one thing, in reality, there are lots of people who are getting organized and making sure that they're finding ways to get patients the care that they need. Doctors of the World are doing fantastic work on this as well. So it is happening, and it's happening in an organized way. And it's also happening among people who perhaps wouldn't, consider themselves to be particularly political, or, in other contexts, or be, people who are thinking about things like abolishing the police, for example, but in that direct line of work where these borders are kind of intruding upon their ability to care for others, they are resisting. And that's clearly a really, really important part of that. And if we could see that across many different sectors, we're then looking at the beginnings of a kind of organized resistance. So I find that tremendously heartening to see that work that's going on. And I hope if anyone is tuning in right now who is a health worker or knows a health worker, I hope you'll point them in the direction of Docs Not Cops and the particular kind of guidelines they've got there for resisting.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Arianne. Question for Tanzil now in the hot seat. You've already spoken really brilliantly about this colonial boomerang effect that you're kind of analysing, explaining in the chapter. It's really interesting the way that you focus in on the history of colonial policing in the north of Ireland. I wanted to ask you a bit to kind of explain in a bit more detail what that particular history shows, and particularly what you think it shows us about how racial categories and identities are formed. So it's a very interesting example to choose for thinking about that question and thinking about the role of policing in actually constructing categories of race and racial identity and racial othering, which is something you talk about in the chapter. So I'd love to hear you say a bit more about that, please.
Yeah, of course. So, I kind of deliberately chose the north of Ireland because perhaps it kind of upsets our understanding of what we understand, first of all, by race and racialization, and also the kind of forms of racialization's concomitancy with capital and capital accumulation. This isn't to say that capitalism is necessarily something which created racism, racialization. This pre-existed capitalist modes of production, but there's something, there are unique and specific ways in which capitalism absorbs and reforms forms of racialization. So in particular, on the context of Northern Ireland, so I think it's maybe good to just develop a little bit more the idea of the colonial boomerang, which I briefly kind of mentioned. And so the idea is that there is this kind of reciprocal movement between the colonies and the metropole. And that can include the kind of exchange of technologies, of ideas, of cultures. And so what we saw in the north of Ireland was a kind of a racialization of and policing of dissent and anti-colonial resistance against the British that was transported back into the imperial metropole. And part of this process of racialization often emerges when colonizers are threatened with the requirement to share social space. So racialization describes this process in which colonizers impose classificatory grids on local populations to coordinate particular ends. So this is, I'm using the work of Patrick Wolfe here, where he talks about race is colonialism speaking. And so part of that process of racialization emerges from the kind of material reality of, you know, Britain's kind of primitive accumulation of throwing off Irish peasants off their land, off which they live. And then alongside that is this kind of discursive racialization, right? And so there is this process of orientalization, of representing and essentializing the Irish people as, you know, having, you know, this was a quote from one of the former police chiefs, as having wild shamrock manners that couldn't be tamed. And what this kind of process of racialization and this discourse does is to legitimate particular policing techniques. And then these are kind of transported back into the UK in the policing of racialized communities and working class communities. And sometimes the colonial boomerang is not just in terms of techniques and cultures, but is also in terms of personnel. So one of the things that I kind of mentioned in the book is, you know, Sir Robert Peel, who was one of the progenitors of the modern Metropolitan Police. You know, he served in the north of Ireland. He also served in Mandate, Palestine. And so he's honing his techniques against, you know, racialized populations that have undergone this kind of stratification, that they are in some way kind of disposable or can be policed, and brought that back, you know, to play, you know, to these kind of new urbanized, industrialized cities.
Oh, thank you very much. Becca, are you around? Yes, fantastic. So I wanted to ask you to just say a bit more about a concept in your chapter, which is state abandonment. So this plays a really important, interesting role in your argument, I think. And you talk about the relation between state abandonment and state violence, and it would be fantastic to hear, what this means, state abandonment, and how you think it's related to state violence.
Sure. So I should say, just to the question that you said at the top as well about issues around why we can't appeal to the police in various ways, I just wanted to draw people's attention to an article by Sarah Lamble, who is one of the contributors to the collection, called The False Promise of Hate Crime Laws, which you can find on the Abolitionist Futures website. And I think that's just one really good example of how something that might sound like it's progressive and helpful, like making misogyny a hate crime, for example. Lamble goes into a lot of, you know, really great like detail about the way in which it is a false promise, and how these kinds of carrots dangled in front of us that we're going to be safer and more protected as some kind of vulnerable, targeted group, actually, when we outsource that function to organizations like the police, the outcomes are not the kind of outcomes which we would want. So I just wanted to draw people's attention to that. In terms of the idea of state abandonment, that is a kind of, in part, something that I borrowed from Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, who I think Tanzil mentioned earlier. So I think basically the idea is that you see an increase in the aggressive, hard-edged and violent infrastructures of the state, often when you see the kind of caring functions of the state being stripped back and pulled away. So when you have things, you know, we've lived through this in the past decade, right? When you have services that have been providing care for people. One sort of very clear example might be something like mental health services. This is not something which I think about uncritically. I think mental health services have lots of carceral functions as well. But the ability to access, for example, free therapy for a decent period of time that you could access through your local authority, which was something that might have been more available prior to 2008, 2010, and now is something which people really, really struggle to access in any kind of meaningful way at all, even when they are in acute mental health crisis. Who steps in more and more when people are left without these kind of caring functions? The police. You now have police being the frontline organisation dealing with people in different kinds of acute mental health crisis, right? You have this with issues around housing. So we know homelessness is kind of indirectly criminalised in lots of ways in this country, through things like vagrancy laws. And so you have the inability of people to access homes, which, you know, you might hark back to 1945 and people accessing, you know, affordable council housing, a caring function of the state, being able to provide people with some kind of affordable home. The less and less that housing is available to people when people are sleeping rough, who are the frontline agency which often come into contact with them, then warehouse those same people in prisons, criminalize them, do not provide them with the kind of things that they might need? Police, right? So it's not to say that this is some kind of well, necessarily calculated relationship that people are kind of plotting and coming up with, but that you see it as a dynamic which happens wherein when caring and supporting services are pulled away, these kind of more aggressive bits of infrastructure from the state often move in. And I guess one of the kind of the way that that relates particularly to the argument in the chapter is that for lots of groups in this country, that has always been something which they experience. So particularly irregular migrants, as we've heard about today, racialized groups have often experienced a lack of protection, a lack of care, a lack of access to state services in various ways, and a much greater presence in their lives of those harder edged, more aggressive and more violent arms of the state. And so it's a kind of relationship which we see not only happen on a kind of national scale, but applied in particular ways to particular groups. And, you know, relating to the kind of argument about the far right, this is the sort of thing that they can lobby for. So, you know, exactly as we've heard from Arianne, the way in which particular people based on their immigration status are denied life-saving healthcare without having to pay, and then when they are unable to pay, met with immigration enforcement, met with policing. This is another kind of potent example of it.
Oh, thank you, Becca. That was brilliant, and really kind of brought to mind a question that I really want to put to all of you. Thinking about the kind of, you were talking about the kind of caring or supportive arm or functions of the state being kind of stripped back and the violent arm goes in. Something else that I know that you've worked on, and this seems to very much relate to what Arianne and Tanzil are talking about as well, is the way that actually policing can itself take place under a rubric of caring, so be presented as a form of caring, even for the very people that it is disciplining, incarcerating, subjecting to violence and surveillance. Some examples that kind of come to my mind are the prevent agenda, which Tanzil has mentioned already, is integrated into public institutions under a rubric of safeguarding. So, you know, you have to surveil your students if you're working in a university for views critical of British foreign policy in order to care for them and protect them from radicalization. Or thinking about something like the welfare or benefit system, and the way that incredibly punitive sanctions for non-compliance with increasingly impossible to kind of comply with exercises, forms of hoop jumping, the kind of surveillance being justified by the thought that, well, you know, people need to stick to the rules of this caring system that's being provided, and then you have the sanctions that come in and you know, remove your ability to feed yourself and your children if you stray from the kind of like full compliance, full obedience. And so I wonder if this is a kind of open question to anyone, really, how you see that policing under the rubric of care operating in the areas that you focus on, and what you think that we can do to kind of to resist it.
I'll start off just because it's a very what the word is, like, evocative example. I think in the area that I work on mostly, which is not so much about the far right's relationship to the police, but about forensic psychology and the role of mental health practitioners in prison building and in prisons in general, this kind of stuff is thrown up all the time. And certainly it's something which you also see in British imperial history. So some weeks ago, I went to the archives and was looking at kind of dispatches from the Colonial office in the 40s and 50s. And there is an article that is written that says there have been uprisings in the Caribbean, and there seems to be a kind of mood for independence and self-determination. But a way that we can maybe deal with this is through facilitating group therapy for people who are worried and would like to have self-determination and independence, but it's something that we can quell with the tool of psychology, right? So it was very like integrated into counterinsurgency campaigns in the British Empire, very plainly. So I think that's one kind of example. You see it often thrown up in contemporary British prisons, wherein people's kind of mental health state is kind of categorized in a particular way, and then that is seen to link them to dangerousness in a way that kind of doesn't go away, and then has lots of implications for their things like their license conditions, as well as the way that they get treated in prison as well. And so I think in terms of how we resist it, it's difficult, right? I think this is one of the kind of invitations of abolition, is that it actually invites us to rethink the way in which even nominally caring institutions operate and work, and actually how power is operating, even when things are not really clearly ugly, but even when they're being presented as very pretty and caring and sweet and like they've got people's best interests at heart. And I think it's one of the maybe harder and tougher conversations that we need to have, or sort of organizing that we need to do, and think about how we build those kind of institutions. But to me, that's one of the most kind of exciting invitations of abolition, is actually interrogating the way in which punitive power operates even amongst supposedly caring and nice and it's in your best interest type interactions with people and institutions, and how do we actually build institutions that are not like that do not have coercive control at their heart, even under a language of, you know, care and support, because it's something which is absolutely rife right now.
Thanks, Becca. Would either of you two like to come in? Actually, just before you do, I had a comment coming in on the chat saying, as a mental health social worker, AMHP, this is going to be a major issue as the Mental Health Act is reformed. Certainly, I feel complicit in people's trauma when the police are involved. And this, I know that there's a campaign ongoing around this, which called Stop SIM, SIM being the Serenity Integrated Mentoring model, which is really around ever more angled relations between policing and access to mental health care. So if I'll see if a link to that can be posted through the live stream. But I think that there's that's a really important campaign, which I think picks up on what you've been saying. There's potentially also something in there that we might raise some questions about. Thinking back to your discussion earlier, Arianne, about the way that pushing back against the criminalization of migration by saying, being a migrant is not a crime, can act to sort of re-entrench or legitimize this notion that some people are criminals, and for the criminals they are disposable, they should be locked up. And there's, so in Stop SIM campaign has the kind of slogan, mental illness is not a crime. And I think that maybe raises some kind of similar questions for how as abolitionists we should be approaching this. Should we be kind of criticizing this, asking, well, what is crime? If crime is breaking the law, then then it is the case that a great deal of mental illness is a crime, because a great deal of policing and the kind of power of the legal system has been directed against neurodivergent people with mental illness for as long as policing has existed. So yeah, there's perhaps a parallel question there. But I'm going to be quiet now and let either you, Arianne, or you, Tanzil, come in and respond to that question.
Sure, I can just come in quickly on that. Yeah, I just wanted to say something actually directly in response to what you just said, which is that it's one of those difficult kind of scenarios, isn't it, where there's maybe a short-term goal and a long-term goal. And the people who are kind of saying, oh, irregular migrants should not be treated as criminals. And you saw this a lot around the Windrush scandal, actually. So there was this stuff around, the Windrush migrants are being treated like criminals. And what kind of slightly irritated me about that at the time was that people were not pushing it that bit further and saying the way that those people ended up being treated is how irregular migrants are always treated, right? And the problem is that anyone is treated that way, not that it was like the wrong people being treated that way, if that makes sense. But I do sympathize with people who are saying, who are pushing these mental health is not a crime, migration is not a crime kind of angles. It's like a very short-term goal, right, of kind of taking an extraordinarily marginalized group and attempting to kind of improve matters for them. The risk is obviously that this long-term goal gets further away in the process of doing that. But I am sympathetic to those who are I can see why people do that, right? And I also think it's probably possible for us to keep the two to some extent alive at the same time, provided there are people having the other conversation as well, if that makes sense, and provided they're talking to each other, right? So that's on that thing that you just said. The broader question was kind of this thing about care and the police attempting to step into roles where it looks as though they are kind of caring for us or providing, you know, doing things for our protection or well-being, or and I think the obvious case, of course, is how we deal with sexual transgressions of various kinds, right? And this idea that, you know, like the proposal that was made earlier this year about police going into nightclubs and stuff, right? And I think, just going back to the book, Melanie's chapter really resonated with me on this, because I was, you know, there's a moment at the beginning of that chapter where Melanie talks about the reaction to the Harvey Weinstein trial, right? And then and this kind of feeling of, on the one hand, I'm glad there's some justice taking place. On the other, I'm horrified by the form that justice is taking, right? And I think for me, when it comes to sort of sexual transgressions, that's where I kind of become very, very worried, but also very aware that, you know, we need something that's going to feel much more satisfying and effective. And it needs to feel like care, but we have to be extraordinarily careful that we do not allow police to kind of step into that role, because they, this year more than ever, has demonstrated they are extraordinarily incapable of being in that role, and extraordinarily dangerous in that role.
Thanks a lot, Arianne. I've got another comment coming in saying, as a librarian, it's heartbreaking to see the closure of local public branches thanks to austerity, as these were a space to provide support and expertise in navigating bureaucracy in a neutral space. So much. Thank you for that comment. There's so much in it. This thought about you know, navigating bureaucracy being something that actually support is required for, and resources are required for, points to something really a really kind of crucial feature about the law, which is familiar to really anyone who's been in a position of being criminalized, or kind of struggling to get through a case in the family courts or whatever, or you know, struggling through their asylum claim, and yet which is very, very often forgotten, which is that we have a kind of pay to win institution. Sometimes there's a separation off of, you know, the bad police from the good old judiciary and the court system, which, you know, they might be a bit slow, but they are the ones which deliver the justice. But these kind of whereas the police are maybe a loose cannon of sorts. And what this point about I think this comment really points towards is that the law is not accessible to everyone, even in the most kind of basic sense. This was something that I experienced in, you know, when I was being prosecuted for I had a couple of cases, one where I was arrested for offering a stop and legal advice card to a teenager who was being subjected to a racist stop and search. Another case where I was arrested for writing in chalk in support of cleaners' protest around working conditions at the university, so writing in chalk on the wall of the university. In both of those cases, I had to go through the process of applying for legal aid, and what I found out was that the process of applying for legal aid is so complicated that you need to already be a lawyer in order to even be able to fill in the form. And that kind of thing is replicated through the legal system. And I have got a great deal more by way of kind of background resources and support to be able to navigate that system than a great many of the people who are dragged through it. So yeah, that's just one of the things that comes out from this very rich comment. I know we've only got about, I don't know how the time has gone so quickly, but we've only got about 10 minutes left. So if you do have more questions for the panel, please kind of pop them in so I can put them forward. Tanzil, did you have anything that you wanted to add into this conversation?
I think Arianne and Becca have responded expertly on the last question. So
fantastic. Well, in that case, I've got a free-for-all kind of thing. So this was a again a question from the much hyped study guide, and it was asking for whether in your chapter or elsewhere or kind of in your life that you've encountered an example of policing or a fact about policing that shocked or surprised you, and if you could explain kind of why you had that reaction, and what you think it shows us about policing. Oh yeah, Tanzil, come on in.
So I'm going to online teaching mode there. I think with the Northern Police Modelling Project, which was an organisation that I was lucky enough to be a part of setting up several years ago in Manchester. One of the things that we did, which was borrowing from other organisations like New and Monitoring Project, was to do Know Your Rights workshop. So that would be basically workshops with people in the community to tell them what their rights were upon stop and search. And now we didn't do that because, or subsequently, we didn't do that because we knew that once you're stopped by the police and you tell them what your rights are, what their powers are, how they're circumscribed, that everything will be fine. It's not as if a cop is just going to be like, all right, fair enough, I'll wander off. But I think what it does in quite an interesting way is arguably to illustrate some of the limits of legal responses to prescribing and curtailing police power, right? This is a point that you made earlier on. Legal systems are not and legal powers are not trans-historical. They absorb, the kind of political ecologies and power dynamics in which we're all, a part of. And so, various kind of checks on the exercises of stop and search powers, publications of guidance on how to exercise those powers are fairly futile, because I think they misdiagnose a problem, which is not to do with legal powers or the absence of legal powers, but this is fundamentally about an asymmetrical kind of power dynamic. This is an institution which acts as the kind of armed wing of the state that is able to use force. And I'm not trying to be polemic here. You just speak to a lot of the people that are stopped and searched. And so I think, one of the things I think when we first started out with the Northern Police Monitoring Project was doing these Know Your Rights workshops. We were thought, all right, we're going to see a huge drop in stop and searches in racialized and working class communities, and it did absolutely nothing. But illustrate that there are limits to the transformative potential of legal solutions, and that the real potential for changing anything is about politics and social struggle.
Brilliantly put, Tanzil. Thank you. I think that this speaks back to the question about contesting the labeling of criminal or the criminalization of in particular cases, with some thought that, well, according to the letter of the law, these people are or are not criminals, and whether, according to the letter of the law, police are or are not acting within their powers, taking a more realistic view, actually, of the law and of policing means precisely as you say, kind of noting that these are questions of kind of power on the ground in lots of ways, but that also can help to guard hopelessness that I think I mentioned, like way back at the start, the kind of hopelessness which says, well, if the policy is against us, then there's nothing we can do, because this thought that actually law, policy, police guidelines, any of these kinds of written rules they always only have meaning when they're actually translated into practice on the ground, and it's in that process of them being translated into practice that they can actually often be contested. And your example, Arianne, of healthcare workers who actually are not implementing the forms of everyday bordering that they are mandated to, is a really great example. I've got a question that's come in, and I think I will ask. I will put it to you as the final point on our agenda. It's a big question. Are there examples of where alternatives to policing are taking place, or transitions away from policing are making progress that we can learn from? I think our answer is yes. But I will leave it to you to say, give maybe one example.
I can go.
Go back on.
Are you sure? All right. I'll go. So I think just one thing, I think from a lot of what we've had today, we don't want too much of an alternative to policing, right? As in, like, a lot of what policing is, we don't actually want a reinvention of those functions, because actually those functions, they're no good. One example that I heard years ago, which I was really struck by, which is really similar, I think, to around what Arianne was saying around organising workers as being a really central tactic to be used in this, was in America, and I'm going to forget which state and which city it was. They had a similar problem that I was talking about before, in terms of police constantly being the frontline people that met acute mental health crises, and that being oftentimes an extremely traumatizing, if not, physically injuring, if not lethal experience for the person who was met by the police when they were having that really difficult time. And so what they did was actually work with healthcare workers to talk from lots of different clinics around the city, to talk about what kind of interventions were needed when someone was kind of in that way. And they brought together loved ones, family, friends from around the community who were troubled, who had someone in their life who they loved and who sometimes had those kind of issues, and got the healthcare workers to train loved ones so that they could do that kind of response. But they also brought healthcare workers with them in terms of demonstrating that there was this much wider network of support within the community that they could call on when somebody was in an acute mental health crisis, building up the skills of lots of people around that area. And they then were able, after all of this kind of organising and training and building relationships between people in a number of clinics, they were able to implement don't call 911 kind of policies in the healthcare clinic, so that then the mental health workers were not calling, it was their policy to not call the police as the first port of call. They instead called skilled up members of the community to be able to respond to the issue. And through that, so many other kind of relationships and kind of like nascent organization was produced through kind of creating those connections. And certainly, considering how many people were traumatized and injured and sometimes died after contact with the police, certainly that kind of short, like, had its own life cycle project will have saved people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of abstract what Becca has said and say it a lot less sophisticatedly. I mean, part of what we mean by defund, or what I initially heard as many years ago when I was hanging around with activists in New York, is divestiture. So, you know, when, you know, thinking about what alternatives to the police, a lot of activists in, you know, there's a particular process in which there is some level of public consultation over citywide budgets. You know, it was just about, right, you know, short of abolishing the police, obviously this is what we want to do. You know, their approach to non-reformist reforms was to divest money away from police funds to, you know, public health approaches to deal with, you know, the kinds of issues that Becca mentioned, whilst recognising, you know, the myriad of problems with public health approaches and latent carceralities and you know, the kind of biopolitics in certain kind of public health approaches. But yeah, I think one of the things that I've always thought about as a kind of practical policy platform was kind of divestiture to public health approaches, and that seems to have worked in the States, and I think it's something that we could, you know, entertain here as well.
And I'll just jump in quickly just to kind of echo what Becca already said, which is that an alternative to policing probably won't look like an alternative to policing, probably shouldn't look like an alternative to policing, right? Because we're not trying to replace that function for function. And so the thing that I've always found just really inspiring and obvious as well are the kinds of like survival programs that were run by the Black Panther Party. So while there was this direct resistance to the police, there were also like free breakfast programs for children, and it's through kind of efforts like that, you know, you build up communities of care, you feed people. That's how you have an alternative to the police. You feed people, you make sure people have got houses, you know, you make sure people can access healthcare. And that's why it's so worrying that we're in a situation where housing is in the mess that it's in, healthcare is being progressively taken away from people, and, you know, we had this year meals being taken away from school children, essentially, right? The exact opposite direction of travel to what we need to see if we're going to build the kind of world where policing is going to be unnecessary. So yeah, so I find those kind of programs very, very inspiring, and I think we've got to look backwards, sadly, and realize that, you know, there's so much that we haven't learned from the past yet.
Thank you very much. I was looking in the book for some final pithy example to quote, and I already came up with about 6 different bits I wanted to read. So I thought, no, I'll just stop, draw this to a close, and you can go and read the book yourself if you have not already. Thank you so much to Left Book Club again, and to all of our wonderful speakers. It's been an absolute honor being part of this project with you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak at this event. Thank you, Koshka, for editing this incredible book. And obviously, thank you, everyone who's here tonight, but also the other contributors. Just as quick closing notes, there were actually a few more questions that came in a little bit last minute, but I want to just read them out to acknowledge them, so we know the kind of questions people are asking, and, you know, hopefully they can be answered in other ways. And I'm sure actually most of them are answered in the book as well. So someone asked, as the pandemic continues to move throughout communities in the UK, what role have the police played in the response to it and its knock-on effects, particularly in ways that might not be obvious, which seems like quite a crucial question to discuss at some point. What are the panel's general thoughts about what strategy and lessons can be learned from policing during the pandemic? So a lot of people kind of want to talk about and discuss and explore, particularly how policing and, of course, carceral state approaches have shown themselves during the pandemic. So perhaps can be a topic for another discussion or another event. So thank you very much for tuning in tonight. And if you want to become a member of the Left Book Club, visit leftbookclub.com. Our next event is actually our last event of the anti-capitalism series we've been doing with Gargi Bhattacharya. The last event will be on anti-capitalism and crime with Gargi and some really special guests. All the details will be on our social media, so please follow us there. That's going to be on the 1st of December at 7 p.m. So register and tune in for that as well. And again, thank you. There were a few very nice comments. Someone at the very beginning just exclaimed, "Koshka is the best," with lots of exclamation marks. So I really wanted to read that out. A lot of people were really loving the idea of the glossary and the resources. So I mean, amazing, well done for that. As a part of this incredible project. And actually, interestingly, a lot of healthcare workers who tuned in tonight. So it was great that was discussed and tackled in a very important and meaningful way. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Have a good rest of your evening or day wherever you are. Thank you very much.